Welcome back, welcome back, welcome back to a Sappho Academic. Greetings and salutations. I got another Thomas Sowell debunk video. I really have to properly and surgically deal with the Thomas Sowell situation, seeing how he is the root of black conservative thinking. It only makes sense to attack the root at the base and then continue on to the low hanging fruit that he bears on the black conservative tree. I've done many debunk videos already, but it is becoming more apparent that I have to do these videos on Thomas Sowell, because he's going to continue to be, what's the word I'm looking for? Exalted as if he is some type of leader of black political thoughts, when he's just a leader and being a black political shill for conservatism. He doesn't do anything for black people but black conservatives, and gives them an escape from dealing with the atrocities of enslavement, neocolonialism. He gives black conservatives an excuse to justify colonization. I could go on and on and on, but all I'm going to do is just debunk these old, tired talking points that don't seem to die off. Well, I'm here to slice and dice with the knowledge, of course, with the knowledge, so more people don't become confused. Now, my position has always been that Thomas Sowell cherry picks information to build a narrative. So he is an educated person. He has wrote books, but he is an expert at cherry picking information. I've demonstrated in previous videos. So if you haven't seen any of those videos, go check out all those videos. It cannot be disputed his level of cherry picking information. He does it. I demonstrated it, and I'm going to demonstrate it again. This is going to be a bit more of a lengthy video, and let's get to it. So the book is Black Rednecks and White Liberals: Untold Facts About
The
Slavery.
instrumental use of the history of slavery today also underlies the claim that slavery grew out of racism. For most of its long history, which includes most of the history of the human race, slavery was largely not the enslavement of racially different people, for the simple reason that only in recent centuries has either the technology or the wealth existed to go to another continent to get slaves and transport them en masse across an ocean. People were enslaved because they were vulnerable, not because of how they looked. The peoples of the Balkans were enslaved by fellow Europeans, as well as by the peoples of the Middle East, for at least 6 centuries before the first African was brought to the Western Hemisphere.
Right. So this justification of slavery throughout history is often used to justify the enslavement of the Atlantic, trade, not even trade, invasion, right? They want to, this is classic conservative thought: erase all the nuance, so then everything appears to seem the same. But let me continue on.
Before the modern era, by and large, Europeans enslaved other Europeans, Asians enslaved other Asians, Africans enslaved other Africans, and the indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere enslaved other indigenous peoples of the Western Hemisphere.
Now, I don't know all those other groups. I'm not sure if that is even true, but I will say that none of that the other groups have to do. Even what Africans did to Africans has nothing to do with what Europeans did to Africans. Europeans took enslavement to a whole new level when they brought slaves over with the plantations, with the essaying, SEGS, assault, right? If you think about it, the pillaging, the humiliation, and then afterwards, after the so-called emancipation, all the policies written into law to continue to subjugate so-called freed black people in America, the redlining, segregation, law enforcement, education. I can go on, real estate, insurance. I could go on and on and on. The crack era, drugs imported from another country, directed by a president to go into black neighborhoods. You could say all you want about the drug epidemic and all you want about accountability. Accountability starts where it started. So, if Ronald Reagan was never held accountable for his actions, then we have to continue to talk about the systematic structure until there is some type of acknowledgement and reparation for that as well too. So I do understand about accountability in the modern age of what's going on today, but how did we get here? But I'm going too far off track. But all this is connected. All this is connected, but they want you to think that it's about personal accountability. Both things can be true at the same time. In the current situation we're in, yes, if you are still selling drugs in the community, if you're still even getting in to a situation where you're doing drugs when there really isn't any history of you or your family doing drugs, you're getting yourself into a shitty situation. But that does not mean we should just forget about the atrocities that happen in history because they've never been addressed. There was no justice or reparations for it. You see what I did there? Let's continue.
Slavery was not based on race, much less on theories about race. Only relatively late in history did enslavement across racial lines occur on such a scale as to promote an ideology of racism that outlasted the institution of slavery itself.
Correct. So, while the Republicans, conservatives want to go back all the way back in time about enslavement throughout the world, what we have is the present in front of us and the atrocities in recent times, and we're dealing with the effects.
Wherever a separate people were enslaved, they were disdained or despised, whether they were different by country, religion, caste, race, or tribe. In East Africa, the Maasai were feared slave raiders, and other African tribes, either alone or in conjunction with Arabs, enslaved their more vulnerable neighbors. As late as 1891, it was reported that Manyuema slavers had demoralized surrounding tribes, destroying crops, and famine reigned everywhere. Even in the early 20th century, Abyssinians were still raiding other Africans and carrying off slaves. It was 1922 before the British had gained sufficient control in Tanganyika to stamp out slavery there. Arabs were the leading slave raiders in East Africa, ranging over an area larger than all of Europe. The total number of slaves exported from East Africa during the 19th century has been estimated to be at least 2 million. The form in which the story of slavery has reached most people today has been along the lines of the best-selling book. And
Now, he went through a lot of information, and I'm not even going to dispute the information, but what he's leaving out, you see, there is the cherry picking and then the willful ignorance, leaving out certain pieces of information. In terms of enslavement in Africa, what fueled the enslavement? What was the factor that fueled that came from the Europeans? Yes, it is correct that Africans enslaved other Africans even before Europeans came. There was different customs in terms of enslavement. There wasn't the raping of the men, women, and children. It wasn't mass exploitation. There was actually a humanist approach, believe it or not, to enslavement. You weren't a slave for the rest of your life. There's little principles like that that existed on the continent that wasn't transferred over to the European plantation holders, right? So there are nuances, but the big factor that shifted the landscape was firearms. Firearms was a big deciding factor for these Africans to decide to align themselves with the Europeans. Because once Europeans perfected their firearms, they were looked at as invincible. Now, you could say what you want about firearms and being conquered and conquest. Maybe that's just a game of conquest, but guaranteed without firearms, Europeans will not amass the amount of wealth, human labor, and resources to their disposal with ease. Without firearms, America wouldn't be where it is today. That's why they love their firearms. And I can't blame them, to be honest, for loving their firearms the way that they do, because without them, they would be a weak country, 100%. Europe would also be a weak country. Any country that came in, I mean, it was primarily Europe that came in with the firearms. No African would look at a European as invincible without a firearm in their hand. It just is what it is. Call it conquest, call it whatever you want, but Africans definitely underestimated the savagery of Europeans. Let's go.
Widely watched television miniseries Roots by Alex Haley. Challenged on the historical accuracy of Roots, Haley said, "I tried to give my people a myth to live by. This instrumental use of history, or purported history, is open to the same objections as other instrumental myth-making."
So this was supposed to be a myth. Enslavement was a myth because Alex Haley made a quote.
Despite the impression created by Roots, during the era of the massive slave trade from West Africa, a white man was more likely to catch malaria in Africa than to catch slaves himself. The average life expectancy of a white man in the interior of sub-Saharan Africa at that time was less than 1 year. By and large, men from Europe or the Western Hemisphere came to the coasts of Africa, bought their slaves, and left as soon as possible.
You see what they're leaving out? What did they bring with them to the coast? They brought with them firearms. They demonstrated the use of these firearms. They didn't just come and leave, and they didn't come to the coast with Africans out in cages ready to be taken by Europeans. That was not the case. There was negotiations, forceful negotiations. Firearms. Just remember, that's the name of the game in terms of understanding history. If you want to understand why Africa's resources has been taken away, why there's so much mismanagement, so why there was even subjugation in the first place, because there was resistance all the way up until the 1400s. Why did it change? Why did everything change if Africans were fighting tooth and nail with invaders all the way up to the 1400s? I'm talking about even before the the AD period, before Africans were fighting. How come? How is it that they were fighting all the way to the 1400s and then all of a sudden they became enslaved? The Republicans and the conservatives and Thomas Sowell will tell you that it was because of Africans. The real reason was because of firearms. And I'll repeat it again, without firearms, Europeans in the West, Europeans in general would have not had made it that far in developing their country. Let's continue. But obviously, it's left out in Thomas Sowell's book.
Even so, the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves. It was only
So the death rate, let's
much
repeat
later,
that.
Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the white crews of the ships carrying slaves to the Western Hemisphere were as high as the death rates among the slaves themselves.
So the minority of Europeans on the slave ships died at the same rate as the Africans on the boat. The dozens, maybe even hundreds of Africans on the boat compared to the small crew of Europeans. Why do you think a small crew of Europeans were able to amass a large amount of Africans? Because of firearms. But Thomas Sowell wants you to believe the minority of Europeans that went out died at the same rate as Africans. That may be true. That may be true. Let's say there was 100. Let's say there was 100 Africans on a ship and 10 Europeans, right? One European dies, 10 African dies. Technically, that's the same rate. Technically, that is the same rate if you think about it.
It was only much later, after quinine and other medical measures enabled Europeans to survive where there were tropical diseases, was it possible for them to invade Africa in force and establish empires there. But by then, the Atlantic slave trade had already been ended. During the era of that trade, Africa was largely ruled by Africans, who established the conditions under which slave sales took place. The crew of a slave ship was in no position to defy African rulers and their armies by going out across the land and capturing people willy-nilly. The stronger African peoples captured and enslaved the weaker peoples, the same pattern found over the centuries in Europe, Asia, the Western Hemisphere, and Polynesia.
Yeah, so he's leaving out again that these later on, some of these African tribes were able to get access to firearms, not the exact same firearms that the Europeans were using, but over time there would be more advanced firearms being produced. That means there would be a stock of older firearms that was later given to the Africans.
In Nyasaland, the Ngoni and Yao swaggered over and terrorized other tribes. In Uganda, the Baganda made life miserable for their neighbors, and the Nyoro and Hima of Anko enslaved Toro women and children. The Tutsi dominated the Hutu in Rwanda, the Maasai lorded it over the Kikuyu and Kamba, and the latter, in turn, held the Indorobo in a kind of serfdom. It was precisely the fact that Europeans, except for the Portuguese, seldom participated in the raids that captured and enslaved Africans that enabled most people in Europe and the Americas to remain oblivious to the traumatic experience that this was.
Again, still leaving out the important detail of firearms.
With some Africans committing suicide to avoid capture and wives being whipped as they tried to cling to their husbands or children. Historian David Breon Davis pointed out that Europeans had little contact with the actual process of enslavement, and that as late as 1721, the Royal African Company asked its agents to investigate the modes of enslavement in the interior. Europeans typically saw only the end results, enslaved people being offered for sale on the coast. It was much the same story in the Ottoman Empire, where those who bought slaves had no idea what these slaves had been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds within the West, and especially the destruction been through before. The unique position of the Western world in the history, and especially the destruction of slavery, need not imply that there was unanimity within the West on this institution. In addition to whites who defended the enslavement of Africans on racial grounds, or who opposed general emancipation on social grounds, there were many whites, and even blacks, who defended slavery as a matter of self-interest as slave owners.
So they want to extrapolate the whites that defended enslavement in the West. Okay, I got something. Because I already mentioned this in a previous video, the origin of white privilege. Let's go. The standard image of Southern slavery is that of a large plantation with hundreds of slaves. In fact, such situations were rare. Fully three-fourths of Southern whites did not even own slaves. I repeat, fully 1/4 of Southern whites owned slaves, only 25%. Out of the 25% who owned slaves, 88% owns 20 or fewer. So, out of the 25% of white Southerners that own slaves, 22% owns 20 or fewer, because 88% of 25 is 22. Do the math. Whites who did not own slaves were primarily human farmers. Practically speaking, the institution of slavery did not help these people, and yet most non-slaveholding white Southerners identified with and defended the institution of slavery. Let me repeat that one more time, nice and slow so it sinks in. Yet, even though most Southern whites did not own slaves, white Southerners still identified with and defended the institution of slavery. Though many resented the wealth and power of the large slaveholders, they aspired to own slaves themselves and to join the privileged ranks. They aspired to own slaves themselves and join the privileged ranks. In addition, slavery gave the farmers a group of people to feel superior to. They may have not been poor, but they were not slaves and they were not black. They gained a sense of power simply by being white, aka white privilege. Let's continue on because he wanted to extrapolate the whites that defended, but he's not giving the full picture. He never does.
Although most black owners of slaves in the United States were only nominal owners of members of their own families, there were thousands of other blacks in the antebellum South who were commercial slave owners, just like their white counterparts.
So the majority of black slaveholders owned their family because the goal was to buy their family into freedom, but they were still registered as slaveholders like white people. And now he wants to extrapolate the commercial black slaveholders.
An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more volunteered to fight for the Confederacy in New Orleans were slave owner counterparts. An estimated 1/3 of the free persons of color in New Orleans were slave owners, and thousands of these slave owners volunteered to fight for the Confederacy during the Civil War. Black slave owners were even more common in the Caribbean. In short, there were many defenders of slavery in the West, even in the 19th century. And outside the West, slavery was too widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history is measured. How and why did slavery end in most of the world? There were two major processes. Over the centuries, as more and more territories around the world consolidated into nation-states with their own armies and navies, raiding those territories to capture and enslave the people who lived within them became more hazardous in itself, and also risked military retaliation against the countries from which the raiders came.
I'm gonna let him finish and then I'm gonna go.
Thus, more and more peoples became off-limits to slave raiders over time. Put differently, the areas which remained subject to slave raiding over the centuries were primarily those where the people lived in smaller or weaker societies.
Smaller and weaker societies without firearms. He's forgetting the firearms.
Such societies continued to exist where it was difficult, for geographic or other reasons, to consolidate large areas under one government. This was true of the Balkans. There were two major
Let's
processes.
go
Slavery
back
was too
here.
widely accepted to require defense. No other nation ended slavery in the same way as the United States did, and few ended it after so short a struggle, as history.
So, this final point about the United States ending slavery. So they had a war, okay? They did have a war, Civil War. It was about enslavement. Yes, correct. That did happen. What also happened was reparations for slaveholders. Correct. Slaveholders received reparations for emancipation. Same thing in the UK. I did a video, a debunk video. It was either Hillary Fordridge or Douglas Murray, one of the two. And I talked about how taxpayers in Britain were paying for reparations for slaveholders up until I'm pretty sure the year was either 2017 or 2016. Up until the year 2017, taxpayers were paying reparations to slaveholders. The actual ones who were enslaved never received reparations till this day. And to this day, we have people like Hillary Fordridge, Douglas Murray, Tucker Carlson, and the rest of the black conservatives, white conservatives using Thomas Sowell to discredit enslavement, to boost up colonization, imperialism. This is the ideological battle that we have to go through. This is all the cherry picking that goes on with Thomas Sowell. So I hope you like this video. A book that you should definitely get your hands on is How Europe Underdeveloped Africa. This will definitely up your game in history. And then another book, The Destruction of Black Civilization by Chancellor Williams. With these two books, I guarantee you're going to up your level of knowledge in ancient history. These are not books you just read one time and then you put it away for like, I don't know, 5 years. This is something you're going to have to keep coming back to and reviewing so you could be well versed and using some of the knowledge in this book. I cannot be affected by Thomas Sowell. Thomas Sowell he cannot blow my mind or he can't show me anything. All he can show me is his degeneracy in shilling for white conservatives, white Republicans, whatever. All he can show me is his cherry picking. All he can show me is how to grift, a master grifter. He is an educated person. He is a well decorated person in education. I have to say that. I have to say that, but that does not mean he has the best intentions of Black people at heart. This series was to show and demonstrate the cherry picking that he does. Some of the stuff he says is true, but he builds narratives, counter narratives that you never heard of. So it seems like he is saying something profound and it needs to be in schools. But when you actually look under the hood, when you actually go through the receipts, when you go through the paperwork, it is faulty paperwork. I've showed it time and time again. There are real historians that you should listen to. You should not listen to right-wing conservative economists that call themselves historians that make excuses for enslavement and colonization. That's all I really have. Let me know in the comment section if there's anything that Thomas Hall has said that you want me to look at, I will look at it. Like I said, he's not pure, he is not pure deception. He mixes about, I could say, anywhere between 30% to about 70% of truthfulness, and the rest is deception. Or sometimes he leaves information completely out. This is how he operates. This is what I demonstrated in the previous videos. If you haven't seen the previous videos, you need to see the previous videos. When I did that video, the problem with the black conservatives, this is who it stems from. So this is why I did these videos, and I'll continue to do any more videos until I feel satisfied that this topic of Thomas Sowell has been done and it goes into the archives of the debunk series. And with that, I'll see you to the next video.